The phone call came at 3 in the morning, cutting through the humid Florida darkness like a blade through silk. I sat up in my narrow bed in Key Largo, disoriented by the sound that had pulled me from dreams of coral reefs and turtle migrations. The voice on the other end belonged to Mrs. Patterson, my old neighbor from Oglethorpe Street, her words heavy with the weight of bad news that could not wait for daylight. "Evan, honey, I'm so sorry to be calling at this hour, but I thought you should know your Uncle Mateo passed yesterday morning." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The words hit me like a rogue wave, stealing my breath and leaving me gasping in the darkness of my cramped apartment above the Marine Research Station. Uncle Mateo Cap, as everyone called him, was gone. The man who had taught me to tie nautical knots and read the tides, who had stood in for my father when cancer took both my parents in that terrible car accident 15 years ago, was no longer drawing breath in this world. The gruff old captain, with hands like weathered leather and a heart bigger than the Savannah River itself, had finally sailed beyond the horizon where I could not follow. "The funeral is Thursday," Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice gentle but insistent, like the tide that never stops pulling at the shore. "I know things got complicated with Regina and all, but Evan, he loved you like his own son. You know that, don't you?" I did know that. Or at least I thought I had known it once before Regina Morales swept into Cap's life like a hurricane, bringing her entitled son Blake and her poisonous whispers about family loyalty and blood relations. Before I had fled Savannah like a coward, choosing the solitude of marine research over the messy complications of family drama that had turned every holiday into a battlefield and every phone call into an exercise in diplomatic navigation. After hanging up, I sat in the darkness for a long time, listening to the gentle lap of water against the marina pilings outside my window. My research station felt suddenly small and sterile, a place of hiding rather than purpose. The paper I had been writing about seagrass restoration seemed insignificant now. Academic words that would gather dust while the man who had shaped my love for the ocean lay cold in some funeral parlor, waiting for people who had loved him to say goodbye. I knew I had to go back to Savannah. Despite everything that had happened, despite the years of silence and the bitter taste that Regina's name left in my mouth like old fish, I owed Cap that much and more. He had been my anchor when the world had gone adrift after my parents died, and I would not let him go into the ground without saying goodbye properly, without standing witness to the end of the man who had made me who I was. The drive north would take me through landscapes that grew increasingly familiar as I crossed from Florida into Georgia, where Spanish moss draped the live oaks like mourning veils, and the air grew thicker with each mile, heavy with memory and salt, and the promise of a reckoning I was not sure I was ready to face. Immaculate Baptist Church had never looked more imposing than it did on Thursday morning, its white columns and red brick facade gleaming in the humid sunlight like a monument to grief dressed in its Sunday best. Cars filled the parking lot and lined the street, testimony to the respect that Captain Mateo Morales commanded in this community of fishermen and dock workers, restaurant owners and boat captains, who had known him as a man of his word in a world where promises were as fragile as morning mist over the river. I recognized many of the faces gathered on the church steps, fellow boat captains with sun-weathered hands and eyes that held decades of watching storms approach from the horizon. Dock workers whose backs were bent from years of loading ice and fuel, but whose spirits remained unbroken by the honest labor that put food on their tables. These were my people once, and they welcomed me back with handshakes that spoke of shared grief and gentle words that carried the weight of understanding loss. But as I moved through the crowd, I felt the chill before I saw its source,
like a cold current running beneath warm surface waters. Regina stood near the church entrance, resplendent in black silk that probably cost more than most of these folks made in a month, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the humidity, and her makeup flawless, except for the calculated tears that glistened on her cheeks like dewdrops on a spider's web. She looked every inch the grieving widow, playing her role to perfection for an audience that wanted to believe in her sorrow. "Evan," she said as I approached her, voice carrying just the right note of sorrowful surprise, like an actress who had rehearsed this moment until it felt natural. "How wonderful that you could finally make it back to Savannah." The emphasis on finally was subtle but pointed, sharp enough to draw blood from those who heard it, and several nearby mourners glanced at me with curiosity mixed with something that might have been pity for the nephew who had stayed away too long. The law offices of Hartwell, Morrison and Associates occupied the entire third floor of a gleaming building on Bull Street, all polished marble and mahogany that spoke of old money and older power, like a temple built to worship the god of legal documents and billable hours. I sat in the reception area the next morning, feeling underdressed in my khakis and button-down shirt, watching Regina and Blake murmur quietly in the corner, like conspirators planning the division of spoils after a successful battle. Attorney James Hartwell III was a silver-haired man with the kind of Southern courtesy that could cut you to ribbons while offering you sweet tea, and he ushered us into a conference room dominated by a massive table that could have seated a small army. The will reading itself was swift and brutal as a knife between the ribs, delivered with the measured cadences of someone accustomed to being listened to without question or interruption. "Captain Morales has left his entire estate, including the dock property, the family business, and all associated assets, to his beloved wife Regina and his stepson Blake, to be held jointly with right of survivorship," Hartwell announced, his voice carrying the weight of legal finality that brooked no argument or appeal. The words hit me like a cold wave, even though Blake's comments at the cemetery had prepared me for this moment of complete and utter rejection. Still, hearing it stated so formally, so finally, made something inside my chest constrict painfully, like a fist closing around my heart and squeezing until I could barely draw breath. Regina watched my reaction with barely concealed satisfaction, her eyes bright with triumph, as if my shock and hurt were exactly what she had been hoping to see, like a cat watching a mouse realize it was trapped in a corner with nowhere to run. When I asked about earlier wills, Blake laughed with cruel dismissal, telling me that smart men update their documents when circumstances change, when they gain a real family to replace the temporary arrangements that had outlived their usefulness. I walked out of that marble mausoleum feeling like a man who had just been erased from history, told that 15 years of love and guidance and shared dreams had been nothing more than obligation fulfilled and finally discarded.
In the darkness of my motel room, I read Cap's letter again and again, until the words burned themselves into my memory like brands on my soul, each sentence a revelation that overturned everything I thought I knew about his final months. The documents he had hidden away told a story of systematic fraud and manipulation that made my stomach turn with rage and disgust at the woman who had preyed upon a dying man's confusion and loneliness. Bank statements showed regular withdrawals from the business account, each one signed by Regina and marked as facility improvements or equipment maintenance. But there were no receipts, no evidence that any improvements had actually been made, just a steady stream of money flowing from the dock's accounts into Regina's personal coffers, like blood being drained from a wounded animal. Most damaging of all were printouts of emails between Regina and someone named Marcus Webb at Coastal Development Partners. Correspondence that went back almost 2 years, laying out in cold corporate language Regina's plan to acquire the dock property and sell it for development into luxury marina slips for rich folks with their fancy yachts. The most recent email, dated just 2 weeks before Cap's death, contained Webb's assurance that he could fast-track the permitting process once Regina had clear title to the property, and his excitement about the profit margins they could expect from turning working waterfront into playground for tourists who would never understand what they had destroyed. She hadn't just manipulated a dying man into changing his will. She had orchestrated an elaborate con game designed to steal my inheritance and destroy a piece of Savannah's maritime heritage that had taken 3 generations to build. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated Cap's love for me and his determination to protect our family legacy even when illness clouded his mind and made him vulnerable to her lies. Even sick and confused, he had found a way to fight back, to ensure that the truth would come out after his death, like a message in a bottle washing up on shore long after the ship that carried it had sunk beneath the waves. The Rusty Anchor was exactly the kind of dive bar where working people went to wash the salt and sweat from their throats after a hard day on the water. Its neon sign flickering intermittently, and its parking lot filled with pickup trucks and motorcycles, like a gathering of modern-day pirates plotting their next adventure. Marisol was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with her back to the wall and a clear view of both the door and the bar, like someone who had learned to watch for trouble before it found her. "You read it," she said, as I slid into the seat across from her. And it wasn't a question, because whatever was in my face had made the answer obvious to anyone who knew how to read the signs of a man whose world had just been turned upside down. Over beer that tasted of home and better times, she told me what she had witnessed during Cap's final months. The way Regina had isolated him from his friends and workers. The meetings with lawyers and developers that she thought no one else knew about. The Spanish conversations she had overheard where Regina bragged about cleaning house once the old man was gone. Half the people who worked at that dock had heard Regina's plans, Marisol explained, but they had been afraid to speak up while Cap was alive, afraid of losing their jobs or being branded as troublemakers by a woman who had already demonstrated her willingness to destroy anyone who stood in her way. "But now he's gone and you're here and it's time for the truth to come out," Marisol said. Her weathered face creased with determination that reminded me of Cap himself when he had set his mind to something. "Question is, what are you planning to do about it?"
I thought about the documents in my motel room, about the evidence of Regina's crimes, and the legal battle that lay ahead, like a storm on the horizon. "I need a lawyer," I said, "someone who wasn't in Regina's pocket and who knew how to handle fraud cases that involved more than just money, but family legacy and community heritage, and the kind of justice that couldn't be bought with developers' gold." Sarah Caldwell had her father's eyes, sharp and intelligent and completely unforgiving when confronted with injustice, like steel tempered in the fires of countless legal battles fought for principle rather than profit. Her law office occupied a converted Victorian house near Forsyth Park, its high ceilings and original hardwood floors creating an atmosphere that was both professional and welcoming. Unlike the marble mausoleum where I had been so thoroughly dismissed just days earlier. "I've been waiting for this call," she said as she spread Cap's documents across her antique desk, examining each piece of evidence with the methodical precision of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. "Ever since I heard about the will reading, I've been wondering when someone was going to challenge Regina's sudden windfall, because the whole situation stinks like week-old fish left in the summer sun." Within hours, we were back at Hartwell's office. But this time, I wasn't alone and helpless, but armed with truth and backed by someone who knew how to wield the law like a sword. Regina's face went white when Sarah produced the real will, dated 3 weeks after the fake one, and her carefully maintained composure began to crack like paint peeling off weathered wood when confronted with the bank statements and developer emails that exposed her systematic fraud. "This is impossible," Regina stammered, but her voice lacked conviction, and Blake's bluster about forged documents only made him sound more desperate and guilty. Sarah's presentation was methodical and devastating, laying out the timeline of Regina's deception with the precision of a surgeon removing a cancer that had been growing unseen for too long. When Sarah mentioned the medical records showing Cap's periods of clarity during his final months and quoted Dr. Martinez's notes about his cognitive improvement, Regina's mask slipped completely, revealing the calculating predator underneath. Her threats about fighting until her last breath rang hollow in the face of evidence that could send her to prison for elder abuse and fraud charges that would destroy whatever reputation she had left in this community that valued honesty above wealth. The Chatham County Courthouse had stood witness to countless battles between truth and deception, and as I climbed its steps on the morning of our hearing, I felt the weight of 3 generations of family history resting on my shoulders like a mantle passed down from father to son. Judge Henry Caldwell's courtroom was everything you'd expect from a man who had spent decades dispensing justice with fairness and common sense. The walls lined with law books and portraits of past judges, while tall windows let in streams of golden light that seemed to illuminate the proceedings with divine radiance. Regina sat at the defendant's table with her high-priced Atlanta attorney, her designer suit and perfect makeup doing little to disguise the strain that weeks of legal pressure had etched on her face, like cracks in a foundation that had never been as solid as it appeared.
Blake fidgeted beside her, shooting hostile glances in my direction every few minutes like a child whose favorite toy was being taken away by adults who didn't understand his special claim to ownership. The testimony unfolded like a story written in legal language but powered by human emotion and moral outrage. Dr. Martinez explained Cap's periods of mental clarity with clinical precision, while attorney Robert Morrison from Brunswick described Cap's determination to correct what he called a terrible mistake. But it was Marisol's testimony that truly devastated Regina's case, her weathered face radiating the kind of quiet dignity that comes from a lifetime of honest work, as she described Cap's final months and Regina's systematic isolation of him from his friends and workers. Under cross-examination, Regina's story fell apart like a house of cards in a hurricane, her answers becoming evasive and contradictory when faced with specific questions about dates and amounts. When Sarah produced phone records showing dozens of calls to coastal development partners, Regina claimed she couldn't remember conversations that had been recorded in emails as recent as 2 weeks before Cap's death. Judge Caldwell's verdict was swift and final, like justice dispensed by someone who had seen enough fraud and manipulation to recognize it instantly. The gavel came down with the sound of thunder, and 15 years of exile and abandonment fell away in an instant, leaving me standing as the rightful heir to everything Cap had built, and everything he had dreamed of passing on to the son he had chosen, if not by blood, then by love and loyalty that ran deeper than any legal document. The keys felt heavier than they should have as I stood before the main gate of the dock on a gray Saturday morning, 3 days after Judge Caldwell's ruling. The metal warm from the sun and familiar under my fingers, like coming home to a place that had been waiting patiently for my return. The gate swung open with a creak that spoke of deferred maintenance and deliberate neglect. But underneath the surface decay, the bones of the operation were still strong, like an old ship that had weathered many storms but remained seaworthy beneath the rust and peeling paint. Skipper appeared from somewhere in the shadows, moving with the careful dignity of an elderly cat who had seen too many changes in his lifetime. And when he approached me with cautious optimism, I knelt down to scratch his ears, feeling his purr vibrate through the wooden planks beneath us like the heartbeat of this place that had never stopped loving the people who belonged here. The main dock stretched out into the Savannah River like a welcoming arm, its pilings driven deep into the river bottom by Cap's father during the Depression when men built things to last through whatever storms might come.
In Cap's office, I found a manila folder labeled "For Evan" in his careful handwriting, containing business licenses and permits, property maps, and a handwritten note that was pure Cap, telling me not to panic because I was smarter than I thought and tougher than I knew. The combination to the safe was my birthday, and inside I found the real books showing a business that was profitable despite Regina's theft, an equipment that was mostly sound despite her neglect, and a customer base that had remained loyal despite the uncertainty of the past months. Walking through the property with Marisol, I learned the rhythms and routines that kept the dock running, from the ice house that had to be checked twice daily, to the fuel pumps that required regular maintenance, to the delicate balance of personalities and priorities that made a working waterfront function like a small city, with its own laws and customs and unspoken agreements about territory and respect. By late afternoon, word had spread through the waterfront community that I was back and officially in charge, and boat captains stopped by to introduce themselves and welcome me home, their handshakes firm and their eyes appraising as they measured the nephew who had inherited what their old friend had built, and everything he had dreamed of passing on to the son he had chosen, if not by blood, then by love and loyalty that ran deeper than any legal document.
Tessa Quinn arrived the next morning like a force of nature barely contained in human form, driving up to the dock in a hybrid SUV covered with conservation organization stickers, her red hair tied back in a practical ponytail, and her green eyes already taking in every detail of the property with the analytical intensity I remembered from our graduate school days when she had been the smartest person in every room and unafraid to prove it. "Tell me everything," she said, as I led her on a tour of the property, and I spent the morning explaining the dock's history and current challenges, while she took notes and asked questions that revealed just how thoroughly she understood the complex relationship between conservation and commerce, between tradition and innovation, between the need to preserve what was valuable and the necessity of adapting to survive in a changing world. "What if this wasn't just a working dock?" she said over Cuban sandwiches from Maria's place, spreading a rough sketch across the desk that captured the dock's layout with surprising accuracy. "What if it was also an educational center, a research station, a demonstration of how traditional industries can coexist with environmental protection without losing their soul or their profitability?" I could see practical obstacles everywhere, like rocks hidden beneath the surface of calm water. "That sounds amazing in theory, but how do we pay for it? And how do we make sure it doesn't just turn into another tourist trap that pushes out the working boats that are the real heart of this place?" "Grant money," Tessa said immediately, pulling out her laptop and typing with the rapid efficiency of someone who had written dozens of successful proposals. "NOAA has programs for sustainable fisheries education, the EPA funds water quality monitoring, the National Science Foundation loves projects that combine research with community engagement, and there are private foundations that specifically support working waterfront preservation." Over the following weeks, we worked together to develop a comprehensive plan for the dock's future that would preserve its function as a working waterfront, while adding educational and research components that would ensure its financial sustainability against the development pressures that would only increase as Savannah's tourism industry continued to grow. The Morales Maritime Heritage Center, as we began calling it, would bring visitors to learn about traditional shrimp boat construction, sustainable fishing practices, and the role of working waterfronts in coastal ecosystem health, while the working boats continued operating as they always had. The grand reopening took place on a perfect Saturday morning in early May, with spring sun warming the weathered planks and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of salt and possibility across the Savannah River like a blessing from the sea itself. Almost a year had passed since I had stood in that sterile law office listening to Regina claim what wasn't hers, and the transformation that had taken place felt almost miraculous, like watching something dead come back to life through love and determination and the kind of hard work that Cap had always believed could overcome any obstacle. The dock bustled with activity as 3 generations of Savannah families gathered to celebrate the launch of our Heritage Center, while working boats bobbed gently in their slips
and families with children explored the new interpretive displays that told the story of the dock's history and the traditional skills that kept it alive. In the renovated ice house, now serving as our visitor center, Marisol was leading a group of fascinated tourists through a demonstration of traditional net mending, while Captain Joe Brennan shared stories of great storms and the changes he had seen along the coast over 4 decades of fishing. The morning's highlight was the unveiling of Cap's memorial plaque, mounted near the main dock where everyone who visited would see it, and Judge Caldwell's words carried the weight of a lifetime spent watching Savannah change and grow. Captain Mateo Morales was the kind of man who understood that real wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives you touch and the legacy you leave behind, he said as he pulled away the cloth covering the bronze inscription that read simply, "He taught us that family is made by loyalty, not blood, and that the ocean gives back to those who respect her gifts." When we formally rechristened Cap's old shrimp boat, now restored to perfect condition and renamed Cap's Promise, Skipper leaped aboard with the agility of a cat half his age, settling himself in the wheelhouse with the unmistakable air of a feline who had just claimed his territory. As the sun set over the Savannah River, and I stood with Tessa and our plans for the future, I felt the deep satisfaction of a man who had found his place in the world, and the woman who would help him make the most of it, knowing that Cap's legacy lived on, not just in buildings and boats, but in the community of people who understood that some things are worth fighting for, worth preserving, worth passing on to the next generation with love and hope, and the endless possibility that comes with being exactly where you belong. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.